Okay, so in this lesson we're going to be continue talking about simplifying expressions, and in this particular case we're going to simplify an expression by combining like terms. In the previous lesson we talked about what are like terms and what are not like terms. So what constitutes a like term, what does not constitute like terms. And so in the first part of this lesson we're going to simplify these expressions or algebraic expressions by using the distributive property. So here's what this entails. Suppose we had 4x plus 2x. And so by the distributive property, I can write this as 4 plus 2 times x. I can write it like this, because if I distribute the x like this, I get 4 times x is 4x, and then 2 times x is 2x. But I noticed that 4 plus 2, remember the order of operations, 4 plus 2, you do parentheses first, so 4 plus 2 is 6, so that's just 6x. And so the same idea if I had, let's say, 7xy minus 2xy. And so notice that these are like terms because they both have variable x's and they both have variable y's, and each x is being raised to the same power. They're both being raised to the first power, and each y is being raised to the first power as well. Now, over here, these are like terms also because notice that they both contain the variable x, and both of these x's being raised to the same power. In this case, they're both being raised to the first power. Now, in this case, I can rewrite this using distributive property as 7 minus 2 times xy. And so if I distribute the xy through here, I get 7 times xy, 7xy, and then negative 2 times xy is negative 2xy. And so by using the order of operations, you do parentheses first. 7 minus 2 is 5, so I get 5xy. And so that's the simplification of this expression. So these are like terms, and so I just, when I combine them, get 5xy. Now notice what's happening though. When I combine these like terms, basically what I'm doing is I am adding or subtracting their coefficients. And so notice this coefficient of 4x is 4, and this coefficient of 2x is 2, and so we just said 4 plus 2 is 6, so we get 6x. Over here, now be a little bit careful here because some students seem to want to say that the coefficient here is 2, which in fact it's negative 2. So you're saying 7 plus a negative 2, that's what you're saying, 7 plus a negative 2 is 5. And so therefore it's 5xy. Okay, so we're going to use this idea about adding or subtracting their coefficients in these problems. So it's not a difficult lesson, it's fairly easy to do. So let's look at some examples. Suppose we had this example. And so the directions will say simplify. That's what it's going to say. So simplify. All right, now let's look at this. Suppose we had 8w minus w plus 6w. So 8w minus w plus 6w. So let's just go ahead and notice that all three terms, those are like terms because they all have the variable w. So this term has a variable w, this term has a variable w, and this term has a variable w. And each variable w is being raised to the same power. In this case, they're all being raised to the first power. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add their coefficients. We're going to add their coefficients. And so the coefficient of this term here is 8 plus the coefficient of this term here is negative 1. Remember, there's no number there. It's understood to be 1, so this would be a negative 1. And this term here is 6. So using our calculator, you would say 8 plus a negative 1 plus 6, which gives you 13. And so notice that 8 and negative 1 is 7. 7 plus 6 is 13. So we get 13w. And so there's your answer. So those three terms combined gives you the expression 13w. So altogether I have 13 w's. And number 2, suppose you had 3b minus 5 minus 10b minus 4. All right, so notice I have 4 terms here. So these are 4 terms. In a previous lesson, you talked about terms, you talked about how many there were, and you talked about coefficients and so forth. So in this case, there are 4 terms. These terms that right here that I'm underlining, these are like terms because they both have the variable b, and in both cases the b's are being raised to the same power. In this case, they're both being raised to the first power. And so let's look at this in terms of adding their coefficients. So this coefficient here is 3, plus this coefficient here is a negative 10. And so 3 plus a negative 10 on the calculator, if you don't remember your rules for assigned numbers, is negative 7. So these two terms combined is going to give me a negative 7b. So I get negative 7b. Now these terms right here, these two terms, those are constants. All constants can be combined. So all constants can be combined. So this constant, and in the previous lesson we talked about constants. So remember, a constant is a term that doesn't have the variable attached with it. So it's always going to be a negative 5. This is always going to be a negative 4. And a negative 5 plus a negative 4 is a negative 9. So the answer will be negative 7b minus 9. So that's that one. All right, 3. Suppose we had, let's see, negative 9x plus 4x plus 18 minus 10x. So negative 9x plus 4x plus 18 minus 10x. Again, I'm dealing with 4 terms, 1, 2, 3, 4. These terms that I'm underlining, those are like terms because they all have the variable x and they're all being raised to the same power. In this case, the power is 1. So let's add their coefficients. So this coefficient is negative 9 plus this coefficient is 4 plus this coefficient is negative 10. And so when I combine them, negative 9 and 4 is a negative 5. Negative 5 and negative 10 is a negative 15. So this becomes negative 15x. So those three terms combined, these three terms right here, gives me negative 15x. And the only term left is this constant, so I just go ahead and rewrite it. So I get negative 15x plus 18. Now notice that in the way that we're writing this, see how this answer has two terms and this answer has two terms? Normally what we do when we rewrite it, we tend to put the term that has the variable listed first, and we put the constant last. Mathematically, that's how we write it. Now, if you wrote this as negative 9 minus 7b, it's still correct, nothing wrong with that. If you wrote this as 18 minus 15x, nothing wrong with that either. But we tend to write the term that has the variable listed first and the constant listed second. Okay, so let's look at number 4. So number 4, let's suppose we had this. Suppose we had 7x squared plus 8x squared minus 10x squared. So 7x squared plus 8x squared minus 10x squared. All right, notice that these three terms, they're all like terms. They all contain the variable x, and they're all being raised to the same power. In this case, the powers are 2's. So I'm going to just add their coefficients. So when I look at their coefficient, this is a 7, this is an 8, and this is a negative 10. And so 7 plus 8 is 15, and 15 and negative 10 is equal to 5. So this becomes 5x squared. So that's all I get. 5x squared. All right, so now let's see. Let's look at some with decimals in it. So let's look at this example. Suppose we had 6.2x minus 4 plus x minus 1.2. All right, now use your calculator for that. On a test, you may not have enough time to actually do this by hand. So you can use calculator in this course, use a calculator. So I'm going to underline the like terms. So these two terms here are alike. I'm going to do that one first, those variables. And so when I look at this coefficient is 6.2. This coefficient, remember there's nothing there, so this should be 1. So it's going to be a positive 1. So that one, you don't need a calculator for that because you know that 6.2 plus the whole number 1 is just 7.2. So this becomes 7.2x. That's what that is. All right, now my constants, remember the word constants. So the constants. So the constants here are negative 4, and I'm adding a negative 1.2. So if you use your calculator, if you don't remember anything about your sign rules, use your calculator, you punch in -4 and then add a -1.2, you're going to get a -5.2. So the answer is going to be 7.2x minus 5.2. So that's the answer. Okay, number 6. Suppose we had, let's see. All right, suppose we had 3.4m minus 4 minus 3.4m minus 7. I suppose I had that. All right, so again, I have 4 terms. I'm going to underline those like terms. Those two are the variables. And so I can combine those because they both have the variable m and they're both being raised to the same power. So when I add the coefficients, I get 3.4 plus a -3.4, which gives me 0. So those two terms when added up gives me 0. So in the answer, I'm not going to have a term with the variable m in it because those combine to give me 0. So the constants are the only thing I'm going to end up with. So when I combine the constants, I get -4 plus a -7, which is -11. So the answer here is just -11. That's all I get there. Okay, and finally number 7, let's look at number 7. Suppose we had 6x plus 0.5 minus 4.3x minus 0.4x and then plus 3. All right, so let's look at that expression, and we're going to combine like terms. So let's talk about the variable, the terms of the variable x first. So there's this one, there's this one, and there's this one. So when I combine those like terms, and those are like terms because they all have the same variable, and each of those x is being raised to the same power. So when I combine like terms, I'm going to add their coefficients. So this is 6 plus a -4.3 plus a -0.4. And so when I use a calculator, let's see what we get when we use a calculator and add those numbers. So 6 minus 4.3 minus 0.4, 0.4 gives me, it looks like 1.3. So I get 1.3. So this becomes 1.3x, 1 3/10 x. Now the constants, I have 0.5 plus 3. Now that one's easy because you're adding a decimal to a whole number, so that's just 3.5. So the answer is going to be 1.3 plus 3.5. And so there's that. And so this whole lesson right here dealt with simplifying expressions by combining, simplifying expressions by combining like terms. And that was it. That's all you have to do in this lesson. So it's not a difficult lesson. Just remember you have to know the previous lesson in order to do this. So the previous lesson we talked about identifying what like terms are. We talked about coefficients. We talked about terms. And in this lesson, we're combining those. We're combining like terms. All right, so that's going to take care of this lesson.